Shabbat Shalom. I have a friend who, at a certain period of his life, went through a very difficult patch. He'd been in a relationship that broke down, but he had a whole life, and the whole life disappeared from under his feet. Everything in flux. Lost the relationship, career, place to live. And I know that he really prayed. And as we all do perhaps, when we go through our moments of challenge for ourselves, or when there's someone we really love, a family member, one of our children, or the world appear in difficulty. And for him, it didn't happen overnight, but it was amazing. All the pieces eventually came together. And a certain amount of years later, it was 10 times better than it had ever been. It was a complete miracle. In our parsha this morning, Jacob is fleeing his home and heading into the unknown. And he has very little to carry with him as he leaves. Complete crisis. His brother after him for tricking their father into stealing the spiritual blessing of the family. He didn't know anything about what the next steps would bring. As we know, he was a man of tents, but here he was by himself in the wilderness. So he stops in a place and he goes to sleep. And that night he has a dream of a ladder stretching from the ground all the way up to the heavens. And there's angels going up and down, and God is at the very top of the ladder. And God promises, I will be with you, and I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, and this land will be yours, I promised your fathers. And Jacob wakes up. He says, wow, surely God was in this place, and I did not know it. How awesome is this place? It is nothing but God's house and the gateway to heaven. And he goes on to make an altar to God and so on. So the commentators ask, well, what does it mean? What does it mean that this was the gateway to heaven and God's house? It's just the wilderness. What did Jacob realize? And so Rashi, the French commentator, explains, well, he was maybe on the ladder, he saw the temple in Jerusalem far off in the distance, and he knew, well, the temple is a place where your prayers are answered, and he felt, this is the place where my prayers were answered. And on one hand, his prayers were not answered. If you were to ask him what's your prayer, his answer would have been, let's make Esau disappear and get me back home. And that would have been his prayer. That was what he wanted. But maybe his deeper prayer was answered. And what was his deeper prayer? God said, I'm with you, and you are the one who's chosen to fulfill the family blessing. And one day you would return to the land. Jacob did not know it would take 21 years to return, and millennia for his descendants to be as the dust of the earth as was promised, something he would never see. Somehow about that moment filled his heart. God knew what he really wanted to hear, which he couldn't even express himself, what was really there. Let me be fulfilled in my life. And that, say the commentators, that is what it means to be standing before the gateway to heaven. God spoke, and the gates were open, and he heard what he needed to hear. And what is the gateway to heaven? It's the place that gives us hope, and it gives us consolation in our hearts, in a sense that our lives have some kind of meaning and purpose. And that's why Jacob called it God's house. This is a place where I feel that meaning and purpose, because he felt consoled. And that this is the temple, he said. This is it. And the commentators, as mentioned, they go to great lengths. They say, well, how could this be God's house? He's in Beit El Luz, as he says, and the temple was in Jerusalem. Well, some say he saw the temple in that dream. Others say he was suddenly transported into the future temple, and suddenly there he was. But maybe there's another way to understand what Jacob was saying. The temple is the symbol of the place of where we all feel that we can feel a little bit of hope, a little bit of consolation, and discover the place where we receive an answer to our prayers. And eventually that place would be the temple in Jerusalem. For Jacob, at that moment, that temple was in that dream, in his heart and his own mind, in that space of encountering hope. And that was a temple. We know for Jews, the temple symbolized all of that and more when it was standing. And when it was destroyed, that's precisely what people felt was lost. The feeling of hope, the feeling of consolation, the feeling of purpose, the feeling of meaning. And we wandered from country to country without a home, without a temple. And there's an expression in the Talmud that says, since the temple was destroyed, the gates of prayer are permanently closed. And for Jacob, that might have been how he felt. And Jews felt that without God's place, without God's house, how can you find comfort and consolation and like your life is going somewhere, going from land to land? And yet we still build different kinds of temples. We build smaller temples, sanctuaries. And then the Talmud has an interesting comment. It says, the gates of tears are always open. The gates of tears are always open. That our most sincere prayers, that our tears, that they're heard wherever we are. And that we do not know how long it will take, but that eventually the prayers will be addressed in one way or the other. So we're always looking for that temple, always trying to create it, a place where we feel the gates are somehow open, where we will be heard. And at times that temple is an actual temple, a bima and 4 walls and a dedicated space, a sanctuary. But other times the temple is just in our own hearts, in that meeting place. The house of God is wherever we find that consolation. And the ladder is stretching from the temple, is stretching to the heavens, and its feet are grounded on this earth, in our lives, in our hopes, in our labors, everything we work towards throughout our whole lives. And the Baal Shem Tov says, where will the third temple be? In our own hearts. And so Jacob was in a moment of fear and of transition, but what would come next? And maybe his direct prayer was not answered. He did not get what he thought he wanted. And even eventually, the plan of what would happen into his life was different than he might have hoped. But he met something there, and that gave him comfort and consolation and what he needed. And his tears opened up a gate, and there was a temple created before his eyes. As Hannah's prayer does in the passage we read during our holidays, when she's barren and praying and crying for a son, and she's crying so hard that the high priest believes that she's drunk, and yet a child was born to her. And it was maybe not be exactly as she thought. She ended up dedicating the child to the temple, and he would end up being a great prophet, Samuel. But the power of her tears opened up the gates not only for her, but for all of the Jewish people, for all of Israel who needed a Savior at that moment. So at such moments we are all in, may we all find the temples in our hearts. May we find answers to our prayers. May we find comfort and consolation. Shabbat Shalom.